The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Willowbrook Springs, Tennessee, like a gentle prayer whispered across the landscape. It was October 12, 2003, and the small town of 3,200 residents was preparing for another quiet Sunday when the unthinkable happened. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, beloved missionary and cornerstone of the New Hope Baptist Church, simply vanished without a trace. Sarah, at 28 years old, had already dedicated 8 years of her life to serving the people of Willowbrook Springs and the surrounding mountain communities. Her auburn hair and bright green eyes were as familiar to the townspeople as the church bells that rang every Sunday morning. She had arrived fresh from seminary school in 1995, carrying nothing but a worn leather suitcase, a heart full of compassion, and an unwavering faith that would soon touch every corner of their small community. "Sarah wasn't just our missionary," said Mrs. Dorothy May Caldwell, an 82-year-old widow who had known Sarah since her arrival. "She was our daughter, our sister, our friend. That girl could light up a room just by walking into it. She had this way of making everyone feel like they mattered to God." The New Hope Baptist Church, nestled between ancient oak trees on Maple Street, had been Sarah's home base for her missionary work. Under the guidance of Reverend Thomas Mitchell Brennan, a gentleman in his 50s with graying temples and kind eyes, Sarah had established food pantries for struggling families, organized medical missions to remote mountain areas, and created literacy programs for both children and adults. "Sarah saw needs where others saw normalcy," Reverend Brennan often said during his sermons. She had the gift of recognizing hunger, not just for food, but for hope, for dignity, for love. She fed people's souls as surely as she fed their bodies. On that fateful Saturday evening, October 11th, Sarah had attended the weekly planning meeting for the church's upcoming Harvest Festival. The meeting had run late, ending around 9:30 p.m., and several church members remembered seeing Sarah gather her things, a canvas bag filled with festival flyers, her well-worn Bible, and a small leather journal she always carried. Sarah said she was going to stop by the Morrison family's cabin on her way home, recalled Janet Louise Henderson, the church secretary who had organized the meeting. Little Emma Morrison had been sick with pneumonia, and Sarah wanted to check on her. That was just like Sarah. It was almost 10 at night, but she was worried about that little girl. The Morrison cabin sat 3 miles outside town, accessible only by a winding dirt road that snaked through dense forest. Marcus and Linda Morrison, along with their 6-year-old daughter Emma, lived simply off the land, and Marcus worked odd jobs in town to make ends meet. They had been recipients of Sarah's ministry for several years, and Emma adored the young missionary who always brought coloring books and told the most wonderful Bible stories. Marcus Morrison would later tell investigators that Sarah never arrived at their cabin that Saturday night. He had been up late tending to Emma's fever and would have heard any car approaching on the gravel road. The family had been expecting Sarah's visit, as she had promised during the church meeting to bring some homemade soup and medicine. When Sarah failed to appear for Sunday morning service at New Hope Baptist Church, alarm bells immediately rang throughout the congregation. Sarah had never missed a Sunday service in 8 years, not through illness, not through mountain blizzards, not even during the terrible flood of 2001 when half the town was underwater. Reverend Brennan stood at the pulpit that Sunday morning, his usual sermon notes replaced by a heavy heart and growing concern. "Brothers and sisters," he announced to the worried congregation, "our dear Sarah seems to be missing. I'm asking everyone to bow their heads in prayer for her safety while we organize search efforts." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every able-bodied member of New Hope Baptist Church, along with volunteers from the Methodist, Presbyterian, and Catholic churches in town, formed search parties that combed every inch of the road between the church and the Morrison cabin. They searched until darkness fell, calling Sarah's name through the dense Tennessee forest, their voices echoing off the ancient hills. Sarah's small blue Honda Civic was found Monday morning by Deputy Sheriff Michael James Crawford. The car was discovered in a shallow ravine about 2 miles from the Morrison cabin, hidden by thick underbrush and autumn leaves. The vehicle had clearly run off the narrow mountain road, but the damage was minimal, certainly not enough to explain Sarah's disappearance. The car looked like it had been placed there deliberately, Deputy Crawford reported to Sheriff William Robert Hayes. The impact damage didn't match a high-speed crash, and there were no skid marks on the road above. Plus, the car was positioned nose down in the ravine, but all of Sarah's personal belongings were missing. Detective Jennifer Claire Morrison, no relation to the Mountain family, was called in from the county seat to lead the investigation. A seasoned investigator with 15 years of experience, Detective Morrison had handled missing persons cases throughout the Tennessee mountains, but something about Sarah Whitmore's disappearance felt different. This wasn't a random accident or a simple case of someone getting lost in the woods, Detective Morrison explained to the gathered search volunteers on Tuesday evening. Sarah's purse, her Bible, her journal, and even her jacket were missing from the car. Someone either took those items, or Sarah took them with her when she left the vehicle. The investigation revealed that Sarah's bank account showed no unusual activity, and she had no known enemies or romantic entanglements that might explain her disappearance. Her small apartment above Henderson's general store remained exactly as she had left it, bed made, dishes washed, Sunday dress laid out for church service. Sarah lived like she was ready to meet her maker at any moment, observed Mrs. Henderson, Sarah's elderly landlord. Her apartment was always spotless, her bills always paid on time, her Bible always open on the kitchen table. That girl was prepared for eternity, but she sure wasn't prepared to just up and disappear. As days turned into weeks, the initial frenzy of search efforts gradually gave way to a more methodical, long-term investigation. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation joined the case, bringing cadaver dogs, helicopter searches, and sophisticated equipment to scan the mountainous terrain. They found nothing. The people of Willowbrook Springs refused to give up hope. Prayer vigils were held every Wednesday evening at New Hope Baptist Church, and Sarah's photograph appeared in the windows of every business in town. The local newspaper, the Willowbrook Springs Gazette, ran Sarah's story on the front page for 6 consecutive weeks. "We knew Sarah was special from the day she arrived," wrote editor Robert Charles Fleming in an editorial that would be reprinted in newspapers across Tennessee. "She came to our little mountain town not seeking fame or fortune, but offering service and love. If evil has touched our Sarah, then we will not rest until justice is served and truth is revealed." Reverend Brennan struggled to maintain his congregation's faith during those dark weeks following Sarah's disappearance. His sermons took on themes of trust in God's timing, perseverance through trials, and the belief that all hidden things would eventually come to light. "I know you're asking why God would allow something like this to happen to someone as pure and dedicated as Sarah," he told his congregation 4 weeks after her disappearance. "I'm asking the same questions. But I also know that Sarah's faith was stronger than our fear, her hope deeper than our despair. Whatever has happened to our dear sister, she carried the light of Christ with her into whatever darkness she faced." The congregation wept openly as Reverend Brennan's voice broke with emotion. In the front pew, Dorothy Mae Caldwell clutched a small cross necklace that Sarah had given her for her 80th birthday, whispering prayers that had been on her lips for 29 days straight. As winter settled over the Tennessee mountains, covering the search areas with snow and ice, the active investigation necessarily slowed. Detective Morrison continued following leads and conducting interviews, but with each passing day, the likelihood of finding Sarah alive diminished. After 90 days, Detective Morrison explained to Reverend Brennan during a private meeting in December, missing person cases become significantly more challenging. "We're not giving up, Reverend, but I want you to prepare your congregation for the possibility that we may never know what happened to Sarah." The Reverend nodded gravely, understanding the statistical realities but refusing to surrender his faith. "Detective Morrison," he replied, "I've served the Lord for 32 years, and I've learned that He has His own timeline for revealing truth. Sarah always said that God's justice might be delayed, but it's never denied. I'm going to keep believing that, even if it takes years." Christmas 2003 came and went with a hollow feeling throughout Willowbrook Springs. The harvest festival that Sarah had been planning was cancelled, and the food pantry that she had established struggled to continue without her organizing presence. The medical missions to remote mountain families ceased entirely, leaving some of the poorest residents without regular healthcare access. It wasn't just that Sarah was gone, reflected Marcus Morrison, whose daughter Emma still asked when Miss Sarah would come back with more Bible stories. It was like the heart of our community's outreach had been ripped away. Sarah connected people, the church folks with the mountain families, the young with the old, the wealthy with the poor. Without her, we all kind of retreated into our own little worlds. As 2004 began, life in Willowbrook Springs slowly began to return to a new normal, though Sarah's absence remained a constant ache in the community's heart. Her apartment above Henderson's general store stayed empty. Mrs. Henderson refused to rent it to anyone else, saying she was keeping it ready for when Sarah comes home. Young people in the community, inspired by Sarah's example, began stepping up to continue some of her work. Emma Richardson, a recent college graduate, took over the children's Sunday school program. James Michael Patterson, a local businessman, organized monthly food drives. Mary Catherine Stevens, a nurse at the county hospital, volunteered to provide basic medical care to mountain families. Sarah planted seeds everywhere she went, observed Patterson during a community meeting. Even though she's not here to tend them, those seeds are still growing. That's the kind of legacy a real servant of God leaves behind. But despite these efforts to honor Sarah's memory and continue her work, the burning question remained: what had happened to Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore on that October night in 2003? The lack of answers haunted Willowbrook Springs like a wound that wouldn't heal. Detective Morrison kept the case file on her desk, reviewing it regularly and following up on occasional tips that came in. But as months passed without new evidence, she began to accept that Sarah Whitmore might remain one of those mysteries that would never be solved. "I've worked hundreds of cases," Detective Morrison told her partner in late 2004, "but Sarah Whitmore's disappearance is different. It's like she just vanished into thin air. No body, no ransom demands, no sightings, no nothing. It defies everything I know about missing persons investigations." The case would remain cold for 14 long years, filed away with dozens of other unsolved disappearances and assumed deaths. But in a dense section of forest just 3 miles from where Sarah's car was found, an ancient white oak tree was quietly growing around a secret that would eventually shock the small town of Willowbrook Springs and reveal the truth that so many had prayed to discover. 14 years had passed since Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore's disappearance when Daniel Marcus Ashford arrived in Willowbrook Springs in the spring of 2017. A certified arborist with 20 years of experience, Daniel had been contracted by the Tennessee Department of Transportation to assess and remove diseased trees along the mountain highways that wound through the region. At 45 years old, Daniel was a quiet, methodical man who found peace in the solitude of forest work. Divorced and childless, he had spent the previous decade traveling throughout the southeastern United States, specializing in the health and preservation of old-growth trees. His weathered hands and keen eye could diagnose tree diseases, assess structural damage, and determine the age of a tree with remarkable accuracy. Daniel had heard whispers of the Sarah Whitmore case during his first week in town. Mrs. Henderson at the general store had mentioned it while he was buying supplies, and Reverend Brennan, now in his late 60s with completely gray hair, had shared the story during a chance encounter at the local diner. "That poor girl just vanished," Reverend Brennan had told Daniel over coffee and pie. 14 years now, and we still don't know what happened. Her parents moved away after 5 years of searching. Couldn't bear to stay in a place where their daughter had just disappeared. But those of us who knew Sarah, we still pray for answers every Sunday. Daniel had nodded sympathetically, understanding the pain of unanswered questions. His own mother had disappeared when he was 12, and he knew firsthand how the lack of closure could haunt a community for decades. On the morning of May 22, 2017, Daniel was working in a section of forest about 3 miles from Willowbrook Springs, near the location where Sarah's car had been discovered 14 years earlier. The Tennessee Department of Transportation had identified several trees that posed potential hazards to the winding mountain road, and Daniel's job was to assess which ones could be saved and which needed removal. One tree in particular caught his attention, a massive white oak that appeared to be over 200 years old. The tree stood about 50 yards from the road, its enormous trunk measuring nearly 6 feet in diameter. While the oak appeared healthy from a distance, Daniel's trained eye noticed some concerning signs. unusual bark patterns, slight discoloration in the leaves, and what appeared to be an abnormal bulge in the trunk about 8 feet from the ground. "Let's take a closer look at you, old fellow," Daniel murmured as he approached the ancient tree, his voice carrying the gentle tone he always used when working alone in the forest. He had long ago developed the habit of talking to the trees he worked with, finding comfort in the one-sided conversations. As Daniel circled the massive oak, taking measurements and photographs for his assessment report, he noticed that the bulge in the trunk was more pronounced than he had initially observed. The bark in that area had grown in an unusual pattern, creating ridges and valleys that suggested the tree had grown around some sort of foreign object. Daniel had seen this phenomenon before. Trees were remarkably adaptable organisms that could grow around fence posts, signs, and even small buildings if given enough time. Whatever was inside this oak had been there for many years, possibly decades, allowing the tree to slowly incorporate the object into its own structure. Curious about what might be hidden within the ancient oak, Daniel retrieved his increment borer from his truck, a specialized tool that allowed him to extract core samples from trees without causing significant damage. But as he prepared to take a sample near the bulge, something made him pause. "Lord," Daniel whispered, a prayer that surprised him with its spontaneity, "if there's something in this tree that needs to be found, please guide my hands." Daniel wasn't a particularly religious man, but something about the ancient oak and the peaceful forest setting stirred a spiritual awareness he hadn't felt in years. Instead of using the increment borer, Daniel decided to take a more aggressive approach. Using his chainsaw, he carefully made a small exploratory cut in the bark near the bulge, intending to assess the internal structure of the tree. What he found made his hands tremble and his heart race. About 2 inches beneath the bark, Daniel's chainsaw blade struck something that was definitely not wood. The blade had hit what appeared to be leather, old, hardened leather that had been preserved by the tree's protective embrace for what must have been many years. Daniel immediately stopped the chainsaw and used smaller hand tools to carefully expose what was hidden within the oak. As he gently removed chunks of wood and bark, his breath caught in his throat. Embedded in the heart of the tree was a small leather journal, its cover darkened with age but remarkably well preserved thanks to the oak's protective cocoon. With trembling hands, Daniel carefully extracted the journal from its wooden tomb. The leather cover was soft with age, and the binding was intact despite years of being slowly consumed by the growing tree. On the front cover, embossed in faded gold letters, were the initials SEW. Daniel's pulse quickened as he remembered the story Reverend Brennan had told him about Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore. Could this journal possibly belong to the missing missionary? And if so, how had it ended up inside a tree in the forest where her car had been found? "Please, God," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet forest, "let this bring some peace to the people who have been hurting for so long." With reverent care, Daniel opened the journal to the first page. In neat, feminine handwriting, he read the words that would change everything: "Property of Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore. If found, please return to New Hope Baptist Church, Willowbrook Springs, Tennessee. The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear?" Psalm 27 verse 1". Daniel sank to his knees beside the ancient oak, clutching the journal against his chest. After 14 years of unanswered questions, Sarah Whitmore had left a message from beyond, a testimony preserved by God's own creation, protected within the heart of a tree that had slowly grown around her final words. With hands that shook with the magnitude of his discovery, Daniel began to read the journal entries. The early pages contained routine observations about her missionary work, prayers for specific families, and reflections on scripture passages. But as he turned toward the later entries, dated from September and October 2003, the tone of the writing changed dramatically. September 15, 2003, Lord, I'm troubled by what I witnessed today at the Garrison property. Stephen Harold Garrison was meeting with men I didn't recognize, and there were things being unloaded from trucks that didn't look like legitimate business. I know I shouldn't have been watching, but I was visiting the elderly Mrs. Patterson who lives nearby, and I couldn't help but notice the activity. Should I report this to someone? I don't want to falsely accuse anyone, but something felt very wrong about what I saw. Daniel's heart raced as he read. Sarah had apparently stumbled upon some sort of illegal activity involving someone named Stephen Harold Garrison. As he continued reading, the entries became increasingly concerned and fearful. September 28, 2003, I've been praying constantly about what to do regarding Mr. Garrison. I've seen more suspicious activity at his property, and I'm certain now that illegal drugs are involved. I recognize the signs from my missionary training in urban areas. But Mr. Garrison is a respected businessman in town, and his family has attended New Hope Baptist for 3 generations. Who would believe me? And yet, I cannot in good conscience remain silent about something that is harming our community. October 3, 2003, Mr. Garrison approached me after church today. He was very friendly, but there was something in his eyes that frightened me. He asked if I had been exploring the mountain roads lately and suggested that it might be dangerous for a young woman to drive alone in remote areas. The way he said it felt like a warning, or a threat. Lord, give me wisdom. I feel like I'm standing at the edge of a very dark valley. Daniel's hands trembled as he read Sarah's increasingly anxious entries. She had clearly discovered something dangerous, and someone had been threatening her because of it. As he turned to the final entries in the journal, dated just days before her disappearance, Sarah's fear was palpable in every word. October 10, 2003, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Twice this week I've noticed the same dark truck following me when I visit families in the mountains. I think Mr. Garrison knows that I know about his illegal activities. I've decided to document everything I've witnessed and give a copy to Detective Morrison in the county seat. I cannot let fear prevent me from doing what's right, even if it puts me in danger. October 11, 2003, this may be my final entry. I'm driving to the Morrison cabin tonight after the church meeting, but I have a terrible feeling that something is going to happen. If anything happens to me, I want everyone to know that Stephen Harold Garrison is involved in drug trafficking, using his legitimate construction business as a cover. I've seen evidence of large drug shipments coming through his property, and I believe he's been threatening me to keep me quiet. If I don't survive this night, please know that I go to meet my Lord with no fear, trusting in his perfect justice. My hope is in Christ alone. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore. Daniel closed the journal and pressed it against his heart, tears streaming down his face. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore hadn't simply disappeared, she had been murdered to keep her quiet about a drug trafficking operation. And now, 14 years later, her own words were providing the evidence needed to bring her killer to justice. Thank you, Sarah, Daniel whispered to the ancient oak that had protected her testimony for so many years. Thank you for being brave enough to write it all down. And thank you, Lord, for preserving her words until someone could find them. Daniel carefully wrapped the journal in a clean cloth from his truck and drove immediately to the Willowbrook Springs police station. The small building housed only 3 officers now. Sheriff Hayes had retired years earlier, and the department had been consolidated due to budget cuts. But Daniel knew that Sarah's journal was evidence in a cold case that had never been officially closed. Deputy Timothy James Burke, a young officer who had grown up hearing stories about the missing missionary, listened with growing amazement as Daniel explained his discovery. When Daniel opened the journal and read some of Sarah's final entries aloud, Deputy Burke's eyes widened with recognition. Stephen Harold Garrison, Deputy Burke said slowly. He's still a prominent businessman in the county. Owns Garrison Construction and Development. His family has been in this area for 4 generations. He paused, processing the implications. If what Sarah wrote is true, then we're looking at a 14-year-old murder case that involves one of the most respected families in the region. Deputy Burke immediately contacted the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the county prosecutor's office. Within hours, Detective Jennifer Claire Morrison, now a lieutenant with 29 years of experience, was driving back to Willowbrook Springs to examine the evidence that had literally grown inside a tree for 14 years. I never forgot about Sarah Whitmore, Lieutenant Morrison told Daniel as they sat in the small police station that evening. Her case has haunted me for 14 years. I always felt like there was something we were missing, some piece of evidence that would explain what happened to her. I never imagined that evidence would be preserved inside a tree. As Lieutenant Morrison carefully examined Sarah's journal, she made detailed notes and photographs of each entry. The handwriting was consistent throughout, and the dates correlated perfectly with the timeline of Sarah's disappearance. More importantly, Sarah's descriptions of illegal activities matched patterns that law enforcement had been investigating in the region for years. "Stephen Garrison has been on our radar for other reasons," Lieutenant Morrison explained to Daniel. "We've suspected for years that someone in the area was involved in large-scale drug trafficking, but we've never been able to identify the operation or gather enough evidence for arrests. Sarah's journal provides the missing pieces we've been looking for." News of the journal's discovery spread quickly through Willowbrook Springs. By the next morning, a crowd had gathered outside New Hope Baptist Church, where Reverend Brennan was holding a special prayer service for Sarah and her family. The 90-year-old Dorothy Mae Caldwell, now residing in the county nursing home, was brought to the service in a wheelchair, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Our dear Sarah is finally speaking to us from heaven," Mrs. Caldwell whispered to anyone who would listen. "God preserved her words in that tree, just like he preserved Moses' words in stone. Our girl is still bringing justice to this world, even from the arms of Jesus." Reverend Brennan, his voice thick with emotion, addressed the packed church. "For 14 years, we have prayed for answers about our beloved Sarah. Today, God has answered those prayers in a way that only he could orchestrate. Sarah's own words, preserved by his creation, will finally bring the truth to light and justice to those who harmed her." The congregation wept and prayed as the reality of Sarah's fate began to sink in. She hadn't simply vanished, she had been murdered for trying to protect their community from evil. Her courage and faithfulness, documented in her own handwriting, would finally ensure that her killer faced justice. The arrest of Stephen Harold Garrison on May 25, 2017, sent shockwaves throughout not just Willowbrook Springs, but the entire northeastern Tennessee region. The 62-year-old construction company owner was taken into custody at his sprawling compound outside town, where investigators armed with search warrants discovered evidence that corroborated every detail Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore had written in her journal 14 years earlier. Garrison Construction and Development had indeed been operating as a front for a massive drug trafficking operation that spanned 3 states. Hidden beneath the legitimate construction business were sophisticated tunnels, underground storage facilities, and a distribution network that had been moving millions of dollars worth of illegal drugs through the Tennessee mountains for over 2 decades. Sarah Whitmore was collateral damage in a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise, announced District Attorney Patricia N. Chandler during a press conference 3 days after Garrison's arrest. Her courage in documenting what she witnessed, and her decision to come forward despite obvious personal danger, has finally allowed us to dismantle an operation that has brought immeasurable harm to communities throughout our region. The investigation revealed that Sarah had been murdered on the night of October 11, 2003, not far from where her car was found. Garrison had intercepted her on the mountain road to the Morrison cabin, forced her into his vehicle, and taken her to a remote location where he killed her to prevent her from exposing his operation. Her journal had been with her that night, and in a moment of cruel irony, Garrison had hidden it inside the hollow of the ancient white oak tree, never imagining that the tree would preserve Sarah's testimony for 14 years. Garrison thought he was destroying the evidence by hiding it in the tree, explained Lieutenant Morrison during a community meeting at New Hope Baptist Church. He didn't understand that white oak trees can live for centuries, and that the tree would actually protect Sarah's journal from the elements while slowly growing around it. It's as if God himself preserved Sarah's testimony until the right person could find it. Daniel Marcus Ashford, the arborist whose careful work had uncovered Sarah's journal, found himself thrust into the spotlight as the investigation unfolded. News crews from Nashville, Knoxville, and even Atlanta descended on Willowbrook Springs to cover the story of the Missionary's journal found in a tree. But Daniel remained focused on the spiritual significance of his discovery rather than the media attention. "I've been working with trees for 20 years, Daniel told reporters gathered outside New Hope Baptist Church. "I've seen trees grow around all sorts of objects, fence posts, signs, even bicycles. But I've never seen anything like this. It's as if Sarah knew that tree would protect her words until someone could find them and bring justice for her death." The forensic evidence against Stephen Garrison was overwhelming. In addition to Sarah's detailed journal entries describing his illegal activities, investigators found physical evidence at his property that confirmed his involvement in drug trafficking. More importantly, they discovered items that had belonged to Sarah: her purse, her Bible, and even the canvas bag she had been carrying the night she disappeared. Garrison kept trophies from his crime, Lieutenant Morrison explained to Reverend Brennan during a private briefing. We found Sarah's personal belongings hidden in a safe at his main residence. He couldn't bring himself to completely destroy all evidence of what he had done, but he also couldn't risk disposing of the items where they might be found. The psychological profile suggests he kept them as a way of maintaining control over the memory of his victim. As the investigation progressed, more disturbing details emerged about Stephen Garrison's criminal empire and the extent to which he had corrupted the community that had trusted him. Several prominent local officials had been receiving bribes to look the other way regarding Garrison's activities. The construction projects that had made him wealthy were often used as cover for moving drugs and laundering money. Sarah stumbled upon the tip of a very large iceberg, District Attorney Chandler explained to the families affected by Garrison's crimes. Her death was just one tragedy in a much larger web of corruption and violence that has impacted hundreds of families throughout the region. But her courage in documenting what she saw has allowed us to bring down an entire criminal organization. The trial of Stephen Harold Garrison began 8 months later, in January 2018. The courtroom in the county seat was packed every day with residents of Willowbrook Springs who had come to see justice finally served for their beloved missionary. Sarah's journal served as the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, with each entry read aloud to the jury as evidence of both Garrison's crimes and Sarah's heroic attempts to expose them. Reverend Thomas Mitchell Brennan, now 67 years old, was called as a character witness for Sarah. His testimony about her dedication to the community and her unwavering moral courage brought tears to the eyes of everyone in the courtroom, including several members of the jury. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore was the finest example of Christian service I have ever witnessed, Reverend Brennan told the packed courtroom. She lived every day as if she were answering directly to God for her actions. When she saw evil happening in our community, she couldn't remain silent, even when she knew it might cost her everything. Her death was a tragedy, but her courage has brought redemption to countless families who have suffered because of the defendant's crimes. The defense attempted to discredit Sarah's journal entries as unreliable or fabricated, but the physical evidence was too overwhelming. DNA testing confirmed that blood found at Garrison's property matched samples taken from Sarah's apartment 14 years earlier. Ballistics evidence linked weapons found at Garrison's compound to other unsolved murders in the region. Most damning of all, the defendant's own fingerprints were found on Sarah's Bible and purse. Daniel Marcus Ashford testified about his discovery of the journal, describing in detail how the ancient white oak had preserved Sarah's words for 14 years. His testimony was particularly powerful when he explained the spiritual significance of finding the journal exactly where Sarah had written her final entry. "I believe God led me to that tree," Daniel told the jury. "I've assessed thousands of trees in my career, but something made me look more closely at that particular oak. Something made me decide to cut into the trunk instead of just taking a core sample." Sarah's own words were preserved by God's creation until someone could find them and bring her killer to justice. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: first-degree murder, drug trafficking, money laundering, witness intimidation, and conspiracy. Stephen Harold Garrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 years for the drug trafficking charges. As the judge read the sentence, many in the courtroom wept with relief and gratitude. Dorothy Mae Caldwell, now 91 years old, was helped to her feet by family members and whispered a prayer of thanksgiving loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "Thank you, Jesus, for finally bringing our Sarah home to us. Thank you for making sure her killer pays for what he did to our precious girl." The conviction of Stephen Garrison led to a massive investigation that resulted in the arrests of 17 other individuals involved in the drug trafficking operation. Several local officials were charged with corruption, and millions of dollars in assets were seized and forfeited to the state. The criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for over 2 decades was finally destroyed, thanks to the courage of a young missionary who had refused to remain silent in the face of evil. Following the trial, the community of Willowbrook Springs began the process of healing from wounds that had festered for 14 years. The uncertainty surrounding Sarah's fate had finally been resolved, allowing her friends and supporters to properly grieve her loss while celebrating her heroic actions. Plans were immediately made for a memorial service to honor Sarah's life and sacrifice. The service was scheduled for October 11, 2018, exactly 15 years after her murder, and would be held at New Hope Baptist Church where she had served so faithfully. "Sarah has finally come home to us," announced Reverend Brennan as he planned the memorial service. "Not in the way we hoped and prayed for all those years, but in the way that God intended. Her death brought justice not just for herself, but for countless other victims of the evil she died trying to expose. She is truly a martyr for righteousness, and we will honor her memory by continuing the work she started in our community." The ancient white oak tree where Sarah's journal had been preserved became a place of pilgrimage for Christians throughout the region. A small plaque was installed at the base of the tree, reading, "In memory of Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, 1975 to 2003, faithful servant of God whose courage brought light to darkness and justice to the innocent. The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear?" Psalm 27 verse 1". Daniel Marcus Ashford chose to remain in Willowbrook Springs after completing his contract with the Tennessee Department of Transportation. The discovery of Sarah's journal had affected him profoundly, rekindling a faith that had been dormant since his childhood. He established a tree care business in the area and became a regular attendee at New Hope Baptist Church. "Finding Sarah's journal changed my life," Daniel told Reverend Brennan during one of their regular counseling sessions. "I thought I was just doing my job, assessing trees for the state. But God had a much bigger plan. He used my skills to uncover a truth that brought justice and healing to an entire community. It's made me realize that every talent we have, every skill we possess, can be used for God's purposes if we're willing to be His instruments." The story of Sarah's journal found within the tree spread far beyond the mountains of Tennessee. Christian publications around the world covered the story, and Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore became a symbol of courage and faithfulness in the face of overwhelming evil. Churches throughout the United States used her story as an example of how God can use the sacrifice of one faithful person to bring justice and redemption to many. Dr. Margaret Rose Sinclair, a professor of theology at Nashville Seminary, wrote extensively about the spiritual significance of Sarah's story. Her book, Preserved by Providence, The Sarah Whitmore Story, became a bestseller in Christian bookstores and established Sarah as a modern example of martyrdom in service to community and truth. "Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore represents the best of what it means to be a Christian in the modern world," Dr. Sinclair wrote. "She saw evil flourishing in her community and chose to speak truth to power, even when she knew it would cost her everything. Her death was not meaningless, it was redemptive, bringing justice not just for herself but for countless others who suffered because of the criminal enterprise she died trying to expose." The Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore Foundation was established in 2019 to continue her missionary work throughout the Tennessee mountains. The foundation provides healthcare, education, and spiritual support to families in remote areas, carrying on the legacy of service that Sarah had begun during her 8 years in Willowbrook Springs. "Sarah's work didn't die with her," explained Janet Louise Henderson, who had become the foundation's executive director. "Her example inspired a new generation of missionaries and community servants. The evil that tried to silence her voice has actually amplified it, spreading her message of love and service far beyond what she could have accomplished in one lifetime." As the first anniversary of Garrison's conviction approached, the people of Willowbrook Springs reflected on the miraculous way that God had preserved Sarah's testimony and brought justice after 14 years of uncertainty. The ancient white oak tree continued to grow, its branches reaching ever higher toward heaven, a living testament to the power of faith and the certainty of divine justice. The memorial service for Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore on October 11, 2018, drew over 2,000 people to Willowbrook Springs, transforming the small mountain town into a gathering place for Christians from across the southeastern United States. New Hope Baptist Church, which could accommodate only 300 people, opened its doors to stream the service to overflow crowds gathered in the town square, the high school gymnasium, and even the local fairgrounds. Reverend Thomas Mitchell Brennan, now 68 years old but energized by the opportunity to finally honor Sarah's memory properly, delivered the keynote message from the pulpit where Sarah had taught children's classes and led youth groups for 8 years. 15 years ago today, our beloved Sarah was murdered for having the courage to speak truth to power, Reverend Brennan began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary and beyond to the crowds listening outside. But death could not silence her voice, and evil could not destroy her testimony. God himself preserved her words in the heart of his creation, protecting them until the appointed time when justice would be served. The service included testimonies from dozens of people whose lives had been touched by Sarah's ministry. Marcus and Linda Morrison, now in their 50s, spoke about how Sarah had provided hope and practical help to their family during their darkest times. Their daughter Emma, now 21 and a college student studying social work, read from Sarah's journal about her plans to expand medical missions to remote mountain families. Miss Sarah inspired me to dedicate my life to helping others, Emma told the gathered crowd. She showed me that one person's faithfulness can make a difference in an entire community. I'm studying social work because of her example, and I plan to return to these mountains to continue the work she started. Daniel Marcus Ashford, the arborist whose discovery had brought Sarah's killer to justice, shared his testimony about finding the journal and the spiritual impact it had on his life. His story of how God had guided him to the ancient oak tree brought many in the audience to tears and prompted spontaneous applause. I was just doing my job when I found Sarah's journal, Daniel said humbly. But I've come to understand that God uses ordinary people doing ordinary work to accomplish extraordinary things. Sarah's courage in writing down what she witnessed, and God's faithfulness in preserving her words, shows us that no act of righteousness is ever truly lost. The most powerful moment of the service came when 91-year-old Dorothy May Caldwell was helped to the microphone to share her memories of Sarah. Despite her age and frail health, Mrs. Caldwell's voice was strong and clear as she spoke about the young missionary who had become like a daughter to her. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore was an angel sent from God to our little town, Mrs. Caldwell declared, her words carrying the authority of someone who had known Sarah intimately. She loved the Lord with all her heart, and she loved us with the same perfect love. When evil tried to destroy her, God made sure her voice would continue speaking for justice and righteousness. Our Sarah is home with Jesus now, but her work continues through every life she touched. The service concluded with the dedication of a permanent memorial to Sarah in the town square. The bronze statue depicted a young woman holding a Bible and reaching out her hand in service, with an inscription at the base reading, Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, 1975 to 2003, she being dead yet speaketh, Hebrews 11 verse 4. Following the memorial service, hundreds of visitors made the pilgrimage to the ancient white oak tree where Sarah's journal had been preserved for 14 years. The tree had become a symbol of hope and faith for Christians throughout the region, representing God's ability to preserve truth and bring justice even in the darkest circumstances. The Tennessee Department of Natural Resources designated the white oak as a protected heritage tree, ensuring that it would be preserved for future generations. A small walking trail was created leading from the memorial statue in town to the tree, with markers along the way sharing details of Sarah's story and her impact on the community. People come from all over the country to see the tree where Sarah's journal was found, observed Park Ranger Catherine Marie Williamson, who was assigned to maintain the memorial site. They pray beside the tree, they leave flowers and notes, and many tell me that Sarah's story has inspired them to be more courageous in their own lives. It's become a place where people encounter God in a very real way. The impact of Sarah's story extended far beyond Willowbrook Springs and even beyond the Christian community. Her courage in documenting criminal activity despite personal danger inspired law enforcement agencies to develop new protocols for protecting witnesses and whistleblowers. The Sarah Whitmore Act, passed by the Tennessee legislature in 2019, provided enhanced protection and support for individuals who report criminal activity to authorities. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore's sacrifice has saved countless lives, explained State Senator Rebecca Jane Montgomery, who sponsored the legislation. Her willingness to speak truth to power, even at the cost of her own life, has inspired stronger protections for others who find themselves in similar situations. Her legacy will continue to protect the innocent for generations to come. The criminal investigation that began with Sarah's journal continued to yield results for years after Stephen Garrison's conviction. The drug trafficking network he had operated extended far beyond Tennessee, with connections to criminal organizations in Kentucky, North Carolina, and Georgia. Federal authorities estimated that dismantling Garrison's operation prevented millions of dollars worth of illegal drugs from reaching communities throughout the southeastern United States. Sarah Whitmore's courage literally saved lives, confirmed DEA Special Agent Michael Robert Peterson, who led the federal investigation into Garrison's network. The drug trafficking operation she exposed was responsible for overdose deaths, violence, and community destruction throughout the region. Her willingness to document what she witnessed and to come forward despite obvious danger has made our communities safer. The financial assets seized from Garrison's criminal enterprise were used to establish treatment programs for drug addiction throughout the Tennessee mountains. The Sarah Whitmore Recovery Centers provided counseling, medical treatment, and spiritual support for individuals struggling with substance abuse, many of whom had been victims of the very network Sarah died trying to expose. Dr. James William Harrison, who directed the recovery centers, often shared Sarah's story with patients as an example of how one person's courage could bring healing to many. Sarah's sacrifice continues to save lives every day, Dr. Harrison told families participating in the recovery programs. She died fighting against the evil that destroys communities, and now her legacy is helping people find healing and hope. As the years passed, Sarah's influence continued to grow through the countless lives she had touched during her 8 years of ministry in Willowbrook Springs. The children she had taught in Sunday school grew up to become teachers, nurses, social workers, and missionaries themselves, carrying forward her example of selfless service. Thomas Andrew Patterson, who had been 12 years old when Sarah disappeared, became a missionary in Central America, establishing medical clinics and schools in remote mountain communities. Miss Sarah taught me that following Jesus means serving others, especially those who have no voice, Patterson explained during a visit back to Willowbrook Springs. Every clinic we build, every child we educate, is part of the ripple effect of her faithfulness. The New Hope Baptist Church, which had been devastated by Sarah's disappearance and struggled for years afterward, experienced remarkable growth following the resolution of her case. Membership doubled between 2018 and 2020, with many new members drawn by Sarah's example and the church's commitment to continuing her work. Sarah's story brought renewal to our congregation, observed Reverend Brennan as he prepared for retirement in 2020. People want to be part of a church that produces that kind of faithfulness and courage. Sarah's legacy has attracted a new generation of believers who are committed to serving others and standing up for righteousness. The Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore Foundation expanded its reach throughout the Tennessee mountains and beyond, establishing programs in Kentucky, North Carolina, and Virginia. The foundation's mobile medical clinics served remote communities that had limited access to healthcare, continuing the work Sarah had started during her ministry. Sarah's vision for reaching isolated mountain families has become reality on a scale she never could have imagined, said Foundation Director Janet Louise Henderson. Her death was a tragedy, but God has used it to multiply her ministry many times over. Thousands of families now receive medical care, education, and spiritual support because of programs inspired by her example. Daniel Marcus Ashford, whose discovery of Sarah's journal had set everything in motion, became one of the most requested speakers at Christian conferences throughout the United States. His testimony about finding the journal and the spiritual impact it had on his life inspired countless people to look for God's purposes in their own ordinary work. God doesn't need us to be famous or powerful to accomplish His purposes, Daniel would tell audiences across the country. He just needs us to be faithful in whatever work He's given us to do. I was just an arborist doing tree assessments, but God used that skill to uncover a truth that brought justice and healing to an entire community. The ancient white oak tree where Sarah's journal had been preserved continued to be a place of pilgrimage and prayer for visitors from around the world. The tree's steady growth served as a living symbol of how God can use time and His creation to preserve truth and ultimately bring justice. Professor Margaret Rose Sinclair's book about Sarah's story became required reading in seminary courses on martyrdom and Christian courage. Her analysis of the theological significance of Sarah's sacrifice influenced a generation of pastors and missionaries who saw her example as a model for faithful service in dangerous circumstances. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore represents the highest expression of Christian faithfulness, Dr. Sinclair wrote in her conclusion. She faced the ultimate test of choosing between personal safety and moral courage, and she chose righteousness even unto death. Her story proves that God's purposes cannot be thwarted by evil, and that faithfulness is never unrewarded, even when the reward comes after great sacrifice. As the 5th anniversary of Sarah's journal discovery approached in 2022, the people of Willowbrook Springs reflected on the miraculous transformation their community had experienced. The revelation of Sarah's murder and the conviction of her killer had brought closure to a wound that had festered for nearly 15 years. More importantly, the continuation of her work through the foundation and the countless lives she had influenced created a legacy that continued to grow. Sarah always said that God's justice might be delayed, but it's never denied, Reverend Brennan reflected during his final sermon before retirement. Her life and death proved the truth of that statement. Evil thought it had silenced her voice forever, but God preserved her testimony in the heart of His creation until the appointed time. Sarah's story reminds us that no act of faithfulness is ever forgotten by God, and no sacrifice made in service to righteousness is ever in vain. The bronze memorial statue in the town square became a gathering place for prayer and reflection, especially for young people who were inspired by Sarah's example of courage and service. Local schools incorporated her story into their character education programs, teaching children about the importance of standing up for what is right even when it's difficult or dangerous. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore has become our town's greatest hero, said Mayor Patricia Ann Sullivan during the 2022 commemoration ceremony. Her life showed us what it means to love our neighbors sacrificially, and her death proved that evil cannot ultimately triumph over good. She represents the best of what we aspire to be as a community. The story of Sarah's journal found within the tree had become legendary throughout the Christian world, inspiring books, documentaries, and countless sermons about God's faithfulness and the power of righteous courage. Her example encouraged other whistleblowers and witnesses to come forward despite personal danger, knowing that their courage might prevent others from suffering similar injustices. As visitors continued to come to Willowbrook Springs to learn about Sarah's story and visit the memorial sites, the small mountain town became known throughout the region as a place where faith and courage had triumphed over evil. The annual memorial service on October 11 grew into a major regional event, drawing thousands of people who came to honor Sarah's memory and be inspired by her example. Sarah's influence continues to grow every year, observed current pastor David Matthew Richardson, who had taken over leadership of New Hope Baptist Church after Reverend Brennan's retirement. People come from all over the world to hear her story and to pray at the tree where her journal was found. Many tell us that visiting here has strengthened their own faith and given them courage to face difficulties in their own lives. The preservation of Sarah's testimony within the ancient white oak tree remained the most powerful symbol of her story. Botanists and theologians alike marveled at the miraculous way the tree had protected her journal for 14 years, creating a living monument to God's ability to preserve truth and bring justice in His perfect timing. The tree is a living parable, explained Dr. Richard James Thornton, a professor of botany at the University of Tennessee who had studied the oak extensively. Just as the tree slowly grew around Sarah's journal, protecting it from decay and destruction, God's providence slowly worked to bring justice and healing to the community she loved. The tree stands as proof that God can use His creation to accomplish His purposes in ways we never imagine. On quiet evenings, when the mountain mist settled over Willowbrook Springs and the ancient oak stood silhouetted against the Tennessee sky, visitors often reported feeling a profound sense of peace and purpose at the memorial site. Many described experiencing a spiritual encounter that inspired them to live more courageously and faithfully in their own communities. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore's story had become a timeless testament to the power of faith, the triumph of truth, and the certainty of divine justice. Her courage in the face of evil, her faithfulness unto death, and the miraculous preservation of her testimony continued to inspire people around the world to stand up for righteousness and trust in God's perfect timing. The journal that had been hidden within the heart of an ancient tree for 14 years had finally accomplished what Sarah had always prayed for. It had brought light to darkness, justice to the innocent, and hope to those who had lost faith in the ultimate triumph of good over evil. Through her death, Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore had achieved what she could never have accomplished in life. Her voice now spoke to the entire world about the power of faithful courage and the certainty of divine justice. Her legacy lived on in every life she had touched, every program she had inspired, and every person who heard her story and chose to follow her example of sacrificial love and unwavering faith. The missionary who had disappeared on a dark mountain road in 2003 had become a light that would shine for generations, proving that no act of righteousness is ever truly lost, and that God's justice, though sometimes delayed, is never denied. As the ancient white oak continued to grow toward heaven, its branches reaching ever higher into the Tennessee sky, it stood as an eternal reminder that truth preserved by faith will always ultimately triumph over evil, and that those who die in service to righteousness will never be forgotten by the God they served so faithfully. 5 years after the memorial service, in 2023, the 20th anniversary of Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore's murder was marked by the most significant gathering in Willowbrook Springs history. Over 5,000 people from 43 states and 7 countries converged on the small Tennessee mountain town to participate in what had become known as the Sarah Whitmore International Conference on Faith and Justice. The conference, hosted jointly by the Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore Foundation and New Hope Baptist Church, brought together law enforcement officials, theologians, missionaries, and advocates for social justice to discuss how Sarah's example could inspire continued efforts to combat evil and protect the innocent. Dr. Catherine Rose Harrison, the Foundation's new international director, opened the conference by standing beneath the ancient white oak tree where Sarah's journal had been preserved for 14 years. The tree had grown significantly since Daniel Ashford's discovery, its massive trunk now nearly 7 feet in diameter, its branches spreading wide to provide shade for the hundreds of visitors who gathered beneath it daily. "We stand today in the shadow of God's faithfulness," Dr. Harrison began, her voice carrying across the quiet forest to the assembled crowd. "This tree has become more than a memorial, it's a living testimony to the truth that righteousness will always triumph over evil, that light will always overcome darkness, and that those who sacrifice everything for justice will never be forgotten." The conference featured presentations from law enforcement officials whose work had been directly impacted by Sarah's story. FBI Director Jonathan Michael Sterling shared how the protocols developed from Sarah's case had helped protect hundreds of witnesses and whistleblowers across the United States. "The Sarah Whitmore protocols have revolutionized how we protect individuals who risk their lives to expose criminal activity," Director Sterling explained to the packed auditorium at Willowbrook Springs High School. "Her courage in documenting what she witnessed, even knowing it might cost her life, has saved countless other lives through the protective measures we've developed in her honor." The international impact of Sarah's story was highlighted by testimonies from missionaries and human rights advocates from around the world. Sister Maria Rodriguez from Guatemala shared how Sarah's example had inspired her to document and report human trafficking in Central America, despite receiving death threats similar to those Sarah had faced. "Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore showed us that silence in the face of evil is complicity," Sister Rodriguez told the conference attendees. "Her willingness to speak truth to power has given courage to those of us fighting injustice in other parts of the world. When I received threats for exposing human trafficking networks, I remembered Sarah's final journal entry, 'I go to meet my Lord with no fear, trusting in His perfect justice.' Those words gave me strength to continue." Dr. Samuel Robert Mackenzie, a professor of theology at Oxford University, delivered a keynote address on the theological significance of Sarah's story, particularly focusing on the miraculous preservation of her journal within the ancient oak tree. "The preservation of Sarah Whitmore's testimony within the living wood of that magnificent oak tree represents one of the most remarkable examples of divine providence in modern times," Dr. Mackenzie told the international audience. "God used His own creation to protect the truth until the appointed time for justice. The tree became a living sanctuary, a natural tabernacle preserving sacred testimony until human hands could retrieve it and human hearts could receive it." The conference also featured technological innovations inspired by Sarah's story. A team of engineers from Tennessee Technological University had developed a secure digital journaling system for human rights workers and missionaries in dangerous situations. The Sarah Whitmore Digital Witness Protection System allowed users to document crimes and threats with automatic backup to secure international servers, ensuring that vital testimony could never be completely destroyed. Sarah's journal was preserved by the miraculous growth of a tree, explained lead engineer Dr. Jennifer N. Foster. We've created a digital equivalent, a system that ensures the truth can never be completely silenced, no matter what happens to the person documenting it. During the conference, a remarkable discovery was announced that added another layer to Sarah's legacy. While researching her family history for a biographical presentation, genealogist Dr. Michael Joseph Brennan, a distant relative of Reverend Brennan, had uncovered evidence that Sarah was a direct descendant of William Tyndale, the 16th-century Bible translator who was executed for his efforts to make Scripture available to common people. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore carried in her blood the legacy of martyrdom for truth, Dr. Brennan announced to the gasping audience. Just as her ancestor William Tyndale died for translating God's word into the language of the people, Sarah died for exposing evil and protecting her community. The courage to speak truth in the face of mortal danger was literally in her DNA. This revelation sparked renewed interest in Sarah's story among historians and theologians worldwide. The connection to Tyndale was seen as yet another sign of divine providence in Sarah's life and death, suggesting that her sacrifice was part of a much larger tapestry of faith and courage stretching across centuries. The ancient white oak tree continued to serve as a focal point for pilgrims from around the world. The Tennessee Department of Natural Resources reported that over 100,000 people annually visited the tree, making it one of the most visited natural religious sites in the United States. The tree's continued growth was carefully monitored by botanists, who marveled at its vigorous health and unusual longevity. Trees of this age typically show signs of decline, but the Sarah Whitmore oak continues to thrive and grow at a remarkable rate, observed Dr. Patricia Louise Coleman, the state's chief botanist. It's as if the tree has been blessed with supernatural vitality. Some visitors claim to feel a spiritual presence when they pray beneath its branches, and we've documented several instances of people reporting profound religious experiences at the site. The conference concluded with the announcement of the Sarah Whitmore Global Justice Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to protect and support individuals who risk their lives to expose criminal activity worldwide. The initiative, funded by donations from conference attendees and supported by governments, NGOs, and religious organizations from around the world, would provide legal protection, financial support, and safe relocation services for modern-day whistleblowers and witnesses. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore's sacrifice 20 years ago continues to save lives today, announced United Nations Human Rights Commissioner Dr. Alexander James Thompson during the closing ceremony. This initiative will ensure that her legacy of courage and justice extends to every corner of the world where brave individuals risk everything to protect the innocent. The final event of the conference was a candlelight vigil held in the town square, where Sarah's bronze memorial statue was surrounded by thousands of flickering candles. As darkness fell over the Tennessee mountains, the assembled crowd sang hymns that Sarah had loved, their voices echoing across the hills where she had served so faithfully. Dorothy May Caldwell, now 96 years old and one of the last people alive who had known Sarah personally, was brought to the vigil in a wheelchair. Despite her advanced age, her voice was clear and strong as she offered the closing prayer. Lord Jesus, we thank you for the gift of Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore. We thank you for her courage, her faithfulness, and her willingness to sacrifice everything for truth and justice. We thank you for preserving her testimony in the heart of your creation, and we thank you for using her death to bring life and hope to so many others. As we leave this place, help us to carry her example in our hearts and to be as faithful in our own lives as she was in hers. In Jesus' name, Amen. As the conference attendees began to disperse, many made one final pilgrimage to the ancient white oak tree. In the moonlight, the massive tree stood like a cathedral, its branches reaching toward the star-filled sky. At its base, visitors left flowers, notes, and small stones, each one a prayer, a promise, or a commitment to carry Sarah's legacy forward. Daniel Marcus Ashford, now 51 years old and a respected member of the Willowbrook Springs community, served as an unofficial guardian of the tree. He lived in a small cabin nearby and was often seen in the early morning hours, carefully tending to the memorial site and welcoming visitors who came to pray. People ask me if I ever get tired of telling the story of how I found Sarah's journal, Daniel told a group of seminary students who had come to visit the tree. But I never do, because every time I tell it, I remember how God used the most ordinary moment of my life to accomplish something extraordinary. Sarah's story reminds us that we never know when God might use us to reveal truth or bring justice. We just have to be faithful in whatever work He's given us to do. The impact of Sarah's story continued to ripple outward through countless lives. The children who had been in her Sunday school classes were now adults with children of their own, and they continued to share the lessons Sarah had taught them about courage, faith, and service to others. Emma Morrison, the 6-year-old girl Sarah had been visiting on the night she was murdered, had grown up to become a successful social worker specializing in helping families affected by drug trafficking. She often spoke at conferences about how Sarah's memory had shaped her life's work. "Miss Sarah was supposed to visit me the night she died," Emma would tell audiences. "She was bringing soup because I was sick." That simple act of kindness cost her everything, but it also showed me what real love looks like. Every family I help, every child I protect, is part of Sarah's continuing ministry. The Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore Foundation had grown into an international organization with operations on every continent. The foundation's mobile medical clinics, educational programs, and witness protection services had helped millions of people worldwide. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah's story had inspired a new generation of missionaries and human rights advocates who were willing to risk everything to protect the innocent. Sarah's example has created a multiplying effect, explained Foundation President Dr. Rachel Marie Washington during a board meeting in 2024. Every person inspired by her story who goes on to help others creates another ripple in the pond. 21 years after her death, we're still seeing new circles spreading outward from the stone she threw into the water. The ancient white oak tree where Sarah's journal had been preserved had become more than a memorial, it had become a symbol of hope for people around the world facing impossible circumstances. Letters arrived daily from individuals who had visited the tree or simply heard Sarah's story, sharing how her example had given them courage to face their own challenges. One letter, from a young woman in Afghanistan who had risked her life to document human rights abuses, particularly touched the foundation staff. "I have never seen the tree where Sarah's journal was found, but I carry its image in my heart. When I am afraid, I think of how God protected her words in the heart of that tree for 14 years. It gives me hope that my own testimony will someday bring justice, even if I do not live to see it." As 2025 approached, marking the 22nd anniversary of Sarah's death, plans were already underway for another international conference. But the organizers faced a unique challenge. The ancient white oak tree had grown so large that it could no longer accommodate the number of visitors who wanted to pray beneath its branches. "The tree has outgrown our ability to manage the crowd safely," admitted Park Ranger Catherine Marie Williamson. "We're having to limit visits and create viewing areas at a respectful distance. It's a wonderful problem to have, a tree that's become too blessed for its own good." The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Richard James Thornton, the botanist who had studied the oak extensively, suggested creating a network of daughter trees grown from acorns taken from the Sarah Whitmore oak. These trees could be planted at other memorial sites around the world, extending the living symbol of Sarah's legacy to every continent. Just as Sarah's influence has spread far beyond Willowbrook Springs, so can the tree that preserved her testimony, Dr. Thornton explained. Each acorn carries the genetic heritage of the tree that protected her journal. Planting these trees around the world will create a living network of memorial sites where people can pray and remember Sarah's example. The first of these daughter trees was planted in 2025 at the headquarters of the United Nations in New York, with acorns from the Sarah Whitmore oak. Representatives from every member nation attended the ceremony, acknowledging Sarah's contribution to the global fight for justice and human rights. This tree will stand as a reminder that truth cannot be permanently buried, that justice may be delayed but will never be denied, and that the courage of one person can change the world, declared UN Secretary-General Dr. Maria Isabella Santos during the planting ceremony. As news of the daughter tree planting spread around the world, requests poured in from churches, universities, government buildings, and human rights organizations. Soon, saplings grown from the Sarah Whitmore oak were taking root in soil across 6 continents, each one carrying the genetic memory of the tree that had preserved a young missionary's final testimony. Back in Willowbrook Springs, the original ancient oak continued to grow and thrive, its massive trunk now requiring a team of botanists to monitor its health and ensure its preservation for future generations. The tree had become not just a local landmark, but a global symbol of faith, courage, and divine providence. On quiet evenings, when the Tennessee mountain mist settled around the tree and the last visitors of the day had departed, Daniel Ashford would often sit in peaceful contemplation beneath its spreading branches. He would think about the remarkable chain of events that had led him to make his discovery 14 years earlier, and how that one moment of obedience to a whispered prayer had changed so many lives. "Sarah, I hope you know how far your voice has carried," he would whisper to the ancient tree. "You thought you were just writing in a journal to document some local crimes. You had no idea that your words would inspire people around the world to stand up for justice. God truly does work in mysterious ways." The legacy of Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore had become immortal, carried forward not just in the pages of books or the bronze of memorial statues, but in the living wood of trees that would grow for centuries, in the hearts of countless individuals inspired by her courage, and in the ongoing work of justice and righteousness that her sacrifice had set in motion. 22 years after a young missionary disappeared on a dark mountain road in Tennessee, her voice continued to speak to the world about the power of truth, the certainty of divine justice, and the eternal impact of a life lived in faithful service to others. The diary found within the tree had become more than evidence in a criminal case, it had become a sacred text inspiring generations of believers to choose courage over comfort, truth over safety, and righteousness over survival. As the ancient white oak reached toward the eternal sky, its branches heavy with the prayers of millions and its trunk strong with the weight of sacred responsibility, it stood as proof that some things are too precious to be destroyed by evil, too important to be forgotten by time, and too powerful to be silenced by death. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore's final words, preserved by God's own creation, would continue to speak for justice until the end of time.